and welcome to Inspirability. This week, my guest is Charlotte Storey. She is a former West End actor turned women in aviation business coach. So Charlotte, welcome to Inspirability. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's amazing to be here. Thank you very much. It's a real honour.
Oh, well, thank you. So you are a former West End actor, but you've now become a business coach and you specialise in helping women in the aviation sector. So I'm super excited to hear about that today. It's a cause obviously very close to my heart as well.
Yes, it's an amazing aberration for me, really, because I started my life as a West End actor. So I had no idea how my actor training skills as an acting coach would be transferable, but they seem to be very popular, and I'm working in commercial and business aviation, so it's a very exciting move for me.
Well, I'm really excited to hear about the journey and the transformation. But first of all, let's go back to the beginning then and tell me a little bit about Charlotte growing up.
Well, Charlotte was a bit of a misfit, to be honest with you. I found it really difficult at school. It's not a great fit for anybody, really, I don't think, anymore. It's a Victorian structure, isn't it, where you're forced into a kind of pathway that doesn't accommodate any kind of diversity. And I was quite clearly an artist and someone drawn towards creativity, and my school didn't offer any of that kind of stuff. You know, it was core subjects and they were taught very poorly, as often they are, you know, in these really economically deprived areas. I was from a part of Coventry that was particularly economically depressed. I was from a fairly poor family in that situation. So there were no opportunities for extracurricular activities. There were no passionate teachers in my school. And yet there was always a song in my heart. You know, I was a natural musician. I had a great ear for remembering songs on the first hearing. And I had a great innate musical understanding. But there was no one to teach me that. And there were no instruments available to learn to play. And there were no places to go and explore my acting, which is what I ended up doing. So I was doing it privately at home, you know, just with fantasy friends and just really imagining what it would be like to have a life that was a little bit better than that. And I think acting and the arts is exactly that. It gives people this imaginative horizon. That's why people go and spend hundreds of pounds, isn't it, and sit in the dark with people like me, because it takes them away from the awfulness and the boredom and the tedium of their own lives. But childhood was tough. You know, my dad was disabled. He'd had a really serious spinal injury and was disabled quite significantly as a younger man, but still that hung around into my early childhood. And he walked very badly, and he wore a full spiker plaster from his, we used to call it nipple to kneecap, but that's kind of the extent of the plaster. So he couldn't sit down and he couldn't do any kind of interactive activities with us. And that was quite hard.
And so then in terms of acting, how did that then develop in your career?
Well, it was accidental, really. It came a bit further down the line. I was really, really interested in amateur dramatics, and my father's health restored itself enough for him to be involved and take some leading roles in the local amateur operatic society. And I was a member of the chorus, you know, and I got to understand musical direction, got to understand choreographic work, got to understand the importance of the ensemble. So those were really great skills, although I was just on the fringe of that. And then I went to university and I didn't have the confidence to take part in any kind of drama activities, and then went on to do a master's degree in Shakespeare studies. And
so you weren't always confident as a
child?
No, so now you're so full of confidence.
I know, it's extraordinary, isn't it?
It's contagious. So.
Well, it's lovely that I'm able to say to women particularly, I know how you're feeling. You know, I was trapped in a very, very fearful existence, frightened because I hadn't had enough experience of life. I went to Birmingham, and it was a red brick university, and it's otherwise known as the finishing school for young ladies, you know, because it attracts that kind of young lady that comes from an independent school. I'd been to some horrific comprehensive school, you know, with some horrendous teachers and some awful stories that surround that school, particularly awful stories. And I felt the darkness of that. And I'd never been on a plane when I got to university. I'd never been on a foreign holiday, never been on a holiday where we hadn't, you know, kind of washed our bodies over a bucket in a caravan. You know, we'd never been in a hotel, hadn't got any life experiences. And I was there with people who'd had ballooning holidays in Kenya. And, you know, I just didn't know how to fit in. So when I went to a dinner party for the first time, I'd got absolutely no idea what was happening. It's like someone going to bingo for the first time. You know, everyone else knows what's going on and you have no clue. So it was really challenging.
So what advice would you give to someone then that feels that they don't fit in?
It's great that you don't fit in because, you know, you need to somehow luxuriate in your individuality. And I didn't really understand how important that was until I put a musical instrument in my hands. And no one else at that time in my life played the saxophone, and I was really good at it really quickly. And, you know, it's the only thing I've ever really had any natural gifts for. So there was no money for lessons, and someone gave me a saxophone, and it it just worked. I could do it. And very, very quickly I was playing and earning really good money. Very quickly I was doing, pop videos on the telly. Very quickly I'd been spotted and, been integrated into bands where I could have a career. So, my peculiarity meant that I had loads of experience. My mum made me practice my clarinet, for example, in my dad's wardrobe because she didn't want to upset the neighbours with the noise. So, I was used to this sort of closeted aloneness. It sounds peculiar, doesn't it? It sounds like a child safeguarding alert. But it was a really interesting period of self-exploration, and I realised where the edges of myself were in terms of my confidence. But I knew I had something that could help me to communicate, and it wasn't words, it was music.
And you were talking about self-mastery as well. So when did that start, your awareness and your self-mastery?
It's an interesting story, that, actually, because I eventually ended up working in the West End, which to me was extraordinary because I'd never had a drama lesson at school, and I did 1 year postgraduate acting course after my postgraduate degree. And I didn't really have any formal training, so that's only sort of 3 terms. And I think just standing in the light of your own truth on stage is quite an extraordinary thing. And you realise that sometimes 3,000 people have shown up to see you. And self-mastery is all about being able to control all the forces that assassinate you. I call it the inner assassin. And I was standing on the stage at the Liverpool Empire one night, having been quite a long time into this particular tour. When you do a West End show, it spends some time in a London space, and then it tours around the provinces. So everyone gets a chance to see Hairspray or whatever it is that you're in, and it goes back into another venue in the West End. And I was standing on stage at the Liverpool Empire, and they'd had a really terrible storm, and the Empire's quite an old building. And the lighting bar lost its key, and it fell onto the stage in front of me. So loads of hot glass just shattered itself into me, and I screamed. And then the moment's broken, isn't it? That moment of illusion between you and the audience is gone because something real has happened to endanger you. So the safety curtain came down, and about half an hour after that, they re-rigged some temporary lights, and I went back on the stage, and I opened my mouth, and absolutely nothing came out. I was absolutely full of terror. My body was just rigid with absolute fear. And then they put the house lights on, and I looked out at the audience, and there were about 3,000 faces looking at me, and I was absolutely terrified of them. I'd never noticed them before. But suddenly I realised that's what stage fright is. I couldn't live in my own little cupboard bubble anymore. I was suddenly exposed on stage in a total fear state. So I went to see a psychiatrist, and he was charging me £1,000. This is back in the early 1990s when you could buy a flat in London for 40 grand. So he's charging me £1,000 for some therapy. And I thought, well, I've got to do it because I'll be without a career. My production manager said to me, if you don't sort it out, this is it. It's the end of the line. And I only just really started. So I went to see him, and he said, well, stop being so selfish.
Selfish?
And I said, what do you mean?
Goodness.
And he just said, well, this is all about you. You and how you feel about this situation of fear that's going on for you. And he said, what about your audience? As an actor, the most important people are the people sitting in front of you. And I'd never thought about that. He said, I'm going to do an experiment with you. And his offices were on Shaftesbury Avenue. So we went into a theatre, dark space. He gave me a pocket torch. He said, right, shine it now on the audience. So I did. In the stalls, he said, well, don't bother about them. He said, because they will always be theatre goers. He said, try again. So I went up to the grand circle. He said, no, they're still as expensive as the stalls. He said, so move higher. And I went right up to the gods with this little torch. And he said, can you remember as a trainee student, and I did, standing in those Travelex theatre seats, £5, they're just to stand right at the back. He said, they're the people that you are here for, people who are in the queue like you to try and be professional performers. What a luxury you have of being one of the very, very, very few people on earth that gets this opportunity to stand in front of an audience at this incredibly elite level. He said, stop being so selfish and get back and serve your audience. So that was a kind of knockout blow. And then I did go back on the stage, but it was still troubling me. And I went for a job, which I thought I could have aced. It was a film called Blonde Bombshells. And the conceit of the film is that there are 4 younger actors that are eventually played by 4 older veteran actors. And I auditioned for the job, and I really mucked it up because my nerves just got the better of me. And my agent phoned me up. She was a woman of very few words and hurtful words. And she said, Charlotte, it's Rebecca. It's a no. That's all she said. She said, but the person that would have played your older self can't play the saxophone, and she would like you to show her how to mime it. And I was humiliated and angry. I thought, how dare you ask me? And it was £50, and I was broke, and I just paid £1,000 to the other guy. So I thought, you need the work. So she didn't tell me who it was, and just got a Post-it note with an address, went up to the Cotswolds and knocked on the door, and Judi Dench answered it. And it's a bit, embarrassing, isn't it, when you're just an absolute nobody and then you meet a kind of household name like that. And we sat very awkwardly together. And after about half an hour of eating ginger nuts and sipping Earl Grey, I said to her, look, I'm going through this terrible time in my life where I just cannot overcome my performance anxiety. She said, oh, darling, Every time I step on the stage or in front of a camera, I'm as nervous as a kitten. But she said, I've learnt to love the message. And I said, well, what is the message? And she said that the audience is always going to be more important than you.
Which is what the psychologist said as well.
Yeah, but when you haven't learnt the lesson the first time round, it needs to come back to you. And it came back to me through the lips of someone, obviously, that I admire hugely. And that gave me enormous confidence, because if Judy's feeling nervous every time she steps up, it's all right. She said, you have to realise that it's not terror. She said, it's anticipation. So it's just rebranding it and reframing that in your body.
Yeah, it's reframing it as something, being excited for the experience as well. So maybe this is a good point to talk about imposter syndrome. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a classic example, isn't it, of imposter syndrome?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I had it really big time because I couldn't read music. I ended up as an actor, musician in the West End who couldn't read any music whatsoever. So that was hard for me because I learnt by ear. Everyone was looking at the page, and understanding what that music meant and when to come in and when not to come in and when to be silent and how to express it. And for me, that was really, really difficult because I've never, ever been able to read music.
Did you then go away and learn to read music?
I didn't. I can't. No, I'm number blind, and musicality and mathematics have a very significant relationship with one another, and I was always absolutely hopeless at maths. No, I've never been able to do it, and I went on to have a really successful composing career, a musical direction career, but I've never ever been able to read the music in time with the tempo of the music.
So how did you overcome that?
I think I aligned myself with really brilliant people. I had the privilege of working with a wonderful man called Harvey Brough, who had a band called Harvey and the Wallbangers, and he invited me to join him as a musician. And very early in my career, we were doing sampling of music and selling those samples back in the day when it was just on a DAT tape, it's going back to tapes now. But, you'd literally stand with a microphone and you would record stuff and you'd use it as a sort of quick snatch and you'd sell it to recording studios who would then drop it in. We did some work, for example, on some ancient music. There's a little famous lick from Hildegard of Bingen, and we sold it to Beloved, who wrote the famous song The Sun Rising. So that lovely little choral piece in there is something that we sampled in the studio. And I could do that, and that gave me confidence, it gave me contacts. And then I worked with really brilliant piano players. That's the secret, to work with a great chorded instrument player. So that's what I did. I just hid behind a piano player, and then I could organise the theatricality of the music and the shape of it.
So you also used to surround yourself with a good team of people.
It's all about the team, yeah. And there's a lovely message in there actually about experience rather than qualifications. A lot of young people whom I've tutored, because I've done a lot of university lecturing work, a lot of my students say I haven't got those foundational qualifications. And I think employers are a bit wiser to this now, not least because there are so many types of qualifications. The new T-levels have come in, International Baccalaureate comes in at us, from international students. And we don't really know what they mean, even as academics sometimes. So for an employer to evaluate those is really difficult. But if you can show up and under-promise and over-deliver, then your experience is going to really shine out in the workplace. So I tell people never ever to worry about what's on the page, it's what's in the person.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were, say, applying for a role, what would you say people need to have on their CV?
I think an experience that we need as people receiving you on an interview panel is the sense in which we need to know that you can do headlines. We need someone who can just give us a brief. We also need to know that when we drill down, you can provide us with the detail that we need. But also from a human resources perspective, we need to know that we can work with you. So there'll be those sorts of people on the panel. There'll also be the people that try and trip you up. Of course, it's not, an interview isn't a trap, but it's trying to present a scenario in a very short window of time where you've got to present yourself as someone who can be seen in every single setting and under every kind of pressure. So there will always be a curveball question. So always prepare for that, I would say.
Absolutely. So we're talking about university, West End. What next? Came next.
What I did next?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I was in the West End for 15 years doing actor musicianship, and then I moved sideways into music, and I was a saxophonist, and I suppose my particular niche was playing the baritone, and not many people play the baritone, and certainly not many women play the baritone. So it was a really great niche. It looks physically quite spectacular, I think. It's a huge thing if you've never seen it, with lots of, curved tubes at the top. And it gives those wonderful sort of bass notes. I suppose Amy Winehouse brought it back into popular music, some wonderful sort of pumping bass notes, particularly in Back to Black, tunes like that. So for me, it was a really niche instrument, and it got me lots of interesting work. I ended up, doing lots of television work and lots of touring, Rod Stewart, Van Morrison, Natalie Cole. and worked with all of those artists, and then did some of those 1980s revival tours, people who'd probably got 20 years down the line and run out of money. So people like Paul Young and Kajagoogoo, just ended up on the back line of all those sorts of international tours with artists like that, which was great fun. Touring as a musician is a particular thing, and you get to see the world and you don't have to pay for it. And it's a really good life, and it wasn't like the West End. The West End is tiring, and I can see why not many older people do it. 8 shows a week is absolutely physically grueling. And when you come off stage either on a Wednesday or a Friday, you've just done a show, you're going back on stage in another half an hour or so. Same on a Saturday. And on a Sunday, you're so exhausted and you've got your washing to turn around and you're trapped, in a space because you've got to be there in the theatre for at least 5:30 at night. So you can't really go far on the day. So your life during that contract's quite a prison. But for music, you do one gig and then maybe a week off, or, you'll do a number of dates and then there'll be time out. And you're looked after far better as a musician than you ever are as an actor.
So what happened after the music touring?
Well, I had this terrible event in my life. I started to have lots of dislocations, and eventually I needed a replacement of my shoulder. And I was given the first ever plastic shoulder replacement. And it wasn't until 2016 that I found out I had the shoulder in 2008. But I didn't find out until 2016 that it had no license to be implanted in a human being, and it had undergone no clinical trials. And during that time, I'd experienced some terrible fasciitis. All of the skin on my upper body just continues to sort of literally fall away. And you could see right down into the prosthesis. And then I suddenly wasn't producing any red cells, and my immune system was crashing, and I needed lots of iron, and something awful was going on. And I had a call from the National Joint Registry who said, where did this happen? And I said, well, it happened at the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital. And they said, well, this shouldn't really have happened. So it got taken out, and of course when it was taken out, all of the plastic seeded, and it made me incredibly unwell, because you can't find plastic on an X-ray, and it does migrate and seed all over your body. So my battle now is finding out where that plastic is seeding, because invariably, cancer has a lovely relationship with plastic. It feeds it. So I had another shoulder, which was a disaster. It lasted about 6 weeks before it completely dislocated and fell to bits, because I hadn't got enough bone left for it to be situated in. And then they experimented with shoulder number 3, which was completely fused, and that lasted another 6 weeks. So in a year, I'd had 3 replacement shoulders. And taking number 3 out, everything shattered. So I lost a piece of my shoulder blade, all of the shoulder, and most of the humerus. So I'm left now with a situation, I think you can see this on camera, but I'm left with a situation now where, it just, it kind of turns around, because there's nothing to stop it at the top. So I've lost the use of my arm. It's called a flail arm. And I suppose the next step is considering whether I want to lose all of the arm, which is, what was suggested at the time. But I thought, for the purposes of aesthetics, I'll keep it. And I'm glad I did, because it's enabled me to do other things with my life. I've just helped to design an elbow that gives me a bit of structure here.
Absolutely. So that's obviously a huge. I mean, did you know that did this happen over time?
No, it happened really overnight.
Really overnight.
Yes, it was very, very, very sudden indeed. So I couldn't play anymore. I've lost the ability to play, and playing music was a huge part of my life. Not only my career really and my salary, but also my social life. I was in local bands where I lived down in Somerset. And almost every night of the week, I'd be out either playing or rehearsing or just meeting and playing and composing, writing music, and all of that disappeared. It was huge. I find it quite hard to talk about, because it was such a huge thing in my life. And nobody wants to employ disabled actors. Well, nobody did. Things are changing, thank goodness. But nobody really back in the day wanted to employ a disabled musician. So I thought, my dad pushed a brilliant quote in front of me, actually. It's the Stephen Hawking quote that encourages disabled people not to concentrate on the things that they can't do anymore, but to really focus on the things that they can. And I had a great brain and lots of intellectual curiosity. So I applied for a job at the University of Plymouth. They gave me a job as the head of voice at the Conservatoire and University. And I went on to run a drama school in London, the Academy of Live and Recorded Arts, went to be head of acting there. And academia really set me on fire again, and it helped me to plug the huge gap that was there. And I loved the teaching. I love to enable, I love to share my skills and experiences with young people and to see them grow. And I'm a very exacting teacher. I'm very granular and atomised in my process of work. And I think, having cut my teeth teaching young people in drama conservatoires, I realised that there was something very powerful here in scaffolding careers, particularly for women in business. So I suppose that's how, when I came to Learn to Fly, I realised there were women in that sector who were very underrepresented, who may just need a little bit of love and help.
So a lot of our viewers and listeners obviously are in the disability or disabled community, and what's really interesting about your story is hearing, how your life it changed overnight. So for anyone listening, our strapline at Inspirability is you have control, as in you can't control what happens to you, but you can control how you respond to it. So what advice would you give of how you responded and what helped you and what might help our viewers and listeners?
Well, I realised actually that life doesn't happen to you, because there's a choice there, isn't there? There's a huge reactive, angry response. And I'd seen lots of my friends who've been in motorbike accidents. I'm a really keen motorbike enthusiast. Lots of friends have come off bikes, had a T4 spinal break, and that's it. They don't walk anymore. They're angry, resentful, marriages break down, children don't like you anymore. You hate yourself, you can't find a job. These things are really difficult. That's life happening to you. That's your version of events. I'd like to think that life happens for you. It took me a long time to get to this point. It didn't happen overnight. But I realised that life happens for you. And this version of me is not the egotistical, money-grabbing, selfish individual that I was when I was a musician. This person is broken, surrendered, humble, and now not looking to people with more, because that's what my industry was all about. I'm not as good as him, or I'm not earning as much as her. My life now is all about looking at people with less, whom I'd never detected, actually, in my life. I tried to step away from poverty after my childhood experiences. But stepping into showbiz, you obviously are invited to have a different view of the world. But being in hospital beds next to people who had lost arms, legs, and I was at the Royal National Orthopaedic, it's the sharp end of injury or cancer recovery. So I saw people without arms, without legs, hugely cheerful, heroic, people who'd been in London bus bombings or stepped on landmines. These are the sorts of people they deal with. And I just became so fascinated by how I could help. And I just dug deep to think, okay, what skills have I got to rebuild myself? I've always been a really cheerful person, so I think that disposition really was very, very helpful. But it just absolutely changed the direction of my life. This is what I was supposed to be doing. This is the version of me that I really love. People ask me all the time, would you change anything about it? And absolutely, I wouldn't. No.
It's so powerful, and it's really powerful to hear you saying about that transformation within yourself as well, and actually, rather than looking to have more and looking to try and get more, looking at actually what is important. Family and friends and support network, they're always with you all throughout.
It's a very interesting insight, that, actually, because when you become disabled, and most people do become disabled, a majority of people pick up a disability. I say this in my professional speaking, you're only ever temporarily able-bodied, so at some point down the line it's coming at you. And you and I, before this broadcast, were talking about family, who become suddenly very fragile. And rather than having an accident, which is what happens in your enthusiastic youthfulness, you have a fall, so suddenly you're in that older category, and that's quite scary. It's how you deal with it, and how your family and friends can coalesce around that new you. It's not easy. It's a tectonic plate shift. It really is, because I struggle at every point of every day, and I'm so proud that I'm not only able to work, but that people employ me in elite areas to work with elite individuals, and I'm the person on paper, if I hadn't had the previous career that I've had, would never, ever be able to lift themselves off the page, past their disability and into the hiring process. I'm very fortunate to have had my reputation intact before this happened.
But it's just incredibly inspirational as well, the work that you're doing and the work that how you're using your skills to help women as well.
Well, when women return to the workplace after having children, or they take time out to look after elderly parents, that's often not the fate of women, but that's often the shape of your career, that you're looking after people at the bottom end of the age scale and at the top end of the age scale, and you're also trying to be a married person and deal with your own career progress. These are huge tensions that are very unique to women. And I was really keen to come into that environment and give women an opportunity to really investigate the things that we investigate in the rehearsal room. So the first thing I do when I get an actor in front of me is to work out how we can get them into a neutral state, because you can't take on the physicality and the mind frame of a character if you're full of your own tensions. So the first thing to do is to deal with that inner assassin that tells you, no, I can't do that. And we program ourselves, particularly as women, and we help our husbands all the time, don't we, to try and find the job of their dreams, etc. And we could easily be applying for the same job often, but we put ourselves on the back foot, and then we're there to support our spouses very often.
Why do you think we do that?
I think it's habit. If you've not read it, there's a wonderful book called Normal Women by Philippa Gregory, wonderful historical fiction writer. But it's a hugely insightful book. And largely it's just excising things from historical records about women, what women did before the Norman invasion, and what women are now trying to re-establish 1,000 years down the line after 1,000 years have been in eclipse, really.
Do you think things have changed? Because I mean, I sort of look at my mum, and my mum worked when we were younger. She worked part-time, but she also was one of 3 kids. So she ran the house, she did all the housework, ironing, cleaning, as well as juggling a career. And then she was doing professional qualifications development as well. And I think, wow, I don't know how she did it all. I think now there's less pressure to feel like you have to do it all, and that, you know, it's okay to have some help cleaning the house. And, you know, I mean, my husband's great. He really chips in with childcare and helping out where he can. It's more equal, I find. But, you know, do you find that things have changed a little bit now for women?
I think they certainly have. What you're describing in your mum is exactly what I saw in my mum. You know, my dad was disabled, so she was running around trying to be helpful there. There was only 15 months between me and my brother. So again, you know, we were quite demanding. We were both very poorly children. I've got a complex hypermobility disorder, so I was born with dislocated hips, so I didn't walk properly until I was about 3 or 4.
Is that EDS?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
There are lots of types of it. Mine was, you know, I'm very, very floppy, and I've never had much, you know, scaffolding in my body. It's miraculous that I ended up being a West End dancer, isn't it? But I wore a kind of a frog splint all the way through my childhood. You know, didn't learn to walk, so I didn't integrate with anybody. I think lots of my social isolation was to do with the fact that, you know, I couldn't go to nursery and I couldn't do this. So my nan came to live with us, and she did an awful lot. And I'd spent a lot more time with my nan, I think, than I ever did with my mum, having those intimate conversations. And she was Victorian, you know, basically was brought up by a Victorian mother. She was born in 1910. But her life was one of absolute drudgery. My grandfather was idle, didn't want to work. If he didn't like a job, he just left. It was always down to her, you know, to be the economically responsible one. And she just worked slavishly in order to support her 3 children and in order to keep the house going. And they lost houses and they regained houses, all because of my nan's tenacity. But when I got to interview her, as I really wanted to do at the end of her life, and I just recorded all of the stories that I didn't want to be forgotten, because she was very precious to me, I said to her, you know, how would you describe your life? And she said, I wouldn't say I'd have what you would call a happy life. And for me, that was so inspirational, because I thought to myself, what would it take not to have that life of drudgery? And when I became disabled, I'm a real housefrau. I'm really hard to live with, and people find my house a bit like a show home. You know, it's really, really immaculate. It's very Swedish, and it's minimalism, and it's always incredibly tidy. I love order. And I had to get a cleaner for the first time. You know, I can't drag a vacuum cleaner up the stairs, and I can't stand on step ladders and whisk my chandeliers with a feather duster anymore. You know, these things I used to do probably every day. But I just think, you know, it's all right not to be all right. It's all right not to cope. It's fine to ask for help, particularly from your spouse.
Yeah, absolutely.